Today I'm going to do a deep dive of a different sort. I'm going to take a look at a segment of the wargaming hobby that uses cards or card type games in war games. And the latest addition to this segment is Point Blank V is for Victory from Lock and Load Games. And this game, Point Blank, is kind of a callback to one of the original or earlier games, card games in the war game hobby, Up Front. Now, Point Blank is not a reboot of Up Front. It is its own game with its own mechanics and feel and flavor. But it is the closest to Up Front of these games that I'm going to cover today. The other game I want to talk about is Undaunted. Now, this is some may even say this isn't a war game, but this is more of a Euro game because this is a deck building game, and deck building is a concept that comes from Euro games or hobby games, but it is used in a unique way here in Undaunted. Now, I have it in the Undaunted Reinforcements box because there are a couple of iterations of Undaunted Normandy and Undaunted North Africa, but you can put all of those into the Undaunted Reinforcements box that came out, and I like to save shelf space where I can because I have too many games and not enough shelf. So I put it all in the Undaunted Reinforcements box. And the third game I'd like to talk about in this space is Warfighter, the World War II tactical combat card game. Now, it doesn't come in this box. This is the Foot Locker, I think they call this. But there's so much stuff in the Warfighter universe that you need a Foot Locker to put it all in. So I keep all my World War II Warfighter in this box. You can get this separately. Now, there's a lot of Warfighter genres out there. There's modern, there's shadow ops, there's military contractor, which is more of an economic and a business game that's kind of layered on top of the war fighting, so to speak. But I'm going to focus on the World War II in comparison to Point Blank and Undaunted. All three of these games use cards. Cards are the key driver in this game, either from a deck building standpoint or for making your actions. And there's also a similar kind of concept in Warfighter. Also, all the units are displayed in cards, well, especially in Point Blank and in Warfighter. In Undaunted, you actually have a counter that goes on a board, or a modular type board. But the cards or the units are still represented through cards because that's kind of your health. And we'll talk a little bit about that when I get to that. Also, two out of these three share a common aspect in that terrain is represented by the cards. In Point Blank, your terrain is represented by a card. In Warfighter, the different types of terrains that you encounter are also represented by cards. In Undaunted, there's actually a board. There's a square modular board that you can put that together for the different scenarios, these little boards. And so that is a little bit different from these three. But let's look at each one of those aspects in a little bit of a deeper dive. So let's start with the board, or to the extent that there is a board used in the game. I mean, we're talking about card games here, so why is there a board? Well, the first one I want to talk about is Undaunted, which actually uses some manner of board. It has these modular square pieces that are double-sided, have terrain on both sides, and you're going to set these up based on a scenario. Here's the scenario book for Normandy. And as you can see here, you're going to have a setup, which is going to tell you based on the unique number of each of the boards, how you want to arrange those boards, what cards you're going to use in the game, and that's based on the units, and we'll get to that. But it also shows you the setup of where you're going to be setting up your units, which are, again, represented by counters in this game. But there's several different scenarios, and you're going to set up based on, set up the board or set up the terrain based on the scenario. The boards, the little modular boards themselves have, the only information they have is identifiers, so how you use it for setup, and then they have a cover value, so there's going to be different cover values based on that board, and that's going to affect combat. So in this instance, Undaunted actually does have a board that you use and that you're going to move counters on or units on. But it is a card-driven game, and we will, or a card-based game, and we will get to that in a second. So let's now move to the next one I'd like to talk about and kind of compare that, and that is Warfighter, the World War II tactical card game. And it has a board as well, but it's not what you think. This is more of a card holding station, or a place where you can keep track of the cards you're using and how you're playing it. It does have some key information on it. It has your setup and your mission timer. Mission timers are always key to the scenario or key to how you're playing the game. You have an attack chart and attack sequence. That's key for combat. And you have a turn sequence. This is a solitaire game, and so turn sequence is always going to be very important there. You have a place to put a lot of the enemies that you encounter, and then you're going to have basically where your units are along this location track. Now, you don't have a scenario book like you have in Undaunted. What you're going to have in Warfighter is you're going to have a mission, and you're going to have this deck of missions, and you can pick out a mission that you want to play. And what the mission will tell you is, and these are all Europe because I'm trying to keep consistent with the theme as we compare these three, but it's going to tell you how many resources, and that's basically what your build out is on what kind of units and equipment you can do. Your time, that's going to be your mission timer up there. It's going to be your objective. You're going to be drawing objective cards, and there's different objective cards for the different locations, whether you're playing in Europe or Pacific or what have you. And so that's the card that you need to get to and perform something on that card. That's kind of the mission itself. That's the key to the ending the mission. And then you have the loadout, if there's a plus or minus to the loadout. And like this one, this has multiple objectives. This one has 2 objectives there, so multiple objectives. As you can see there, this changes. This one right here, resources 23, that's a very low amount of resources, so you're probably going to take, have an individual or maybe a squad. And this game, as we'll get into the units, this is really kind of focuses on individuals or small groups or type of situation. So you're not going to be having, you're not commanding large number of troops here. This game is, out of all the games, really gets more into the individual level. All of these games are small unit tactical games, what I like to call, which includes everything from platoon down to squad, down to individual. Most of these games are kind of at the squad level. This one has the squad level, but actually goes down to the individual level. So this is really how this is your scenario book, so to speak, is you're going to set out a mission, but your actual locations are going to be from whatever scenario you're picking or whatever mission you're picking. Like this is Europe, you'll have a deck of location cards, and these are the locations that you can encounter. And so these are going to end up being on the board, and you're going to be figuring, and this determines how you move from one location to another. There might be, there's an entrance cost on these, and so you have to expend a certain amount of movement. Sometimes your units have movement built into them. Sometimes you have to use an action card. We'll get to that. That's a common feature among at least 2 of these games here. But the locations have different encounters, like the number of hostiles that you're going to face when you come into this location, or that you're going to put on the board, depends upon what your resource level was. So if you have a high, that one that was like in the 90s, well that one that's nothing. There's 0 hostiles there. Like this one right here, there's going to be 7 hostiles out, and then you're going to be drawing cards. And that's not the number of hostiles, that's like the quantity value of hostiles, because they have a number on them. And you'll be drawing until you reach that number or that limit, and then they'll be on the board. So that's how terrain and locations, and you have all the typical type stuff: road, crops, lane, farm, ford, high ground. traffic hub. So that's how terrain is managed in this case, is somewhat abstract, but your units will be moving, and you have you can get miniatures for them, but usually it's represented by a counter, and you'll be moving them along this track here from location to location till you get to the objective, wherever that objective might be along this track. And you're trying to accomplish that in a certain amount of time. So that is how terrain is represented in Warfighter. It's through cards, and it has unique abilities and determines that will affect combat or affect the number of hostiles or enemies that are there, or entry and the like. So now let's move to the next one here, which is Point Blank. V is for victory. This is the latest one on the tour, so to speak. And this is from Lock and Load Publishing. And you have a board, well, so to speak. You have this mat here, and it's a very nice mat. It's thick. It's single-sided. It's got kind of almost a plastic finish on it, so it's very thick. And you don't have to use this. So there are counters you can use in the game to delineate the rows, the rows and columns that you have on this board, because they're numbered, and that determines how you're moving and how you're doing line of sight and the like. But this is just for positioning purposes. The mat takes up a lot of space, but it's not. You don't have to use it. You can always go to the counters that they provide and kind of lay it out that way, or just kind of memorize kind of where you're at. But this is a nice board, so to speak, or playing surface that has plenty of room to put your cards in. Now, where does the terrain come in? Because this is meaning, what you see on there is kind of meaningless. It's really just you just need to have the marking for the boxes, for the coordinates for the row and column on how you move your units. But the terrain is handled kind of like Warfighter in some respects, and I think it's probably more similar to maybe up front, but you have unique terrain that's going to come out. You're going to have a whole terrain deck, and there'll be a setup in the scenario. Again, we're back to scenario books now, and so you're going to have a scenario here that's going to tell you how to set up the battle, which is mainly telling you the units, because a lot of times the terrain might not be out there at the beginning. Like some of these there was some terrain here. Like there's a river here, stone wall here, and then the objective is a bridge, and the bridge is here, and it's on the other side of the of no man's land. This sector 0, this yellow strip, is kind of considered no man's land or sector 0. A lot of times the missions focus on that or have some of the objectives there, but it's also relevant for measuring like line of sight and the like. But so you're going to have a scenario book that's going to tell you what any starting terrain is going to be out there, and what your units are, of course, and tell you what the terrain setup. But you're going to have a deck of cards that you're going to draw from during the game, and as you move into new terrain, there's going to be different terrain that comes out, and they have all, the bocage, hill, road, and we see this number down here. That's a number that affects combat. Might be like the cover value for that situation. Plus, you also have other things that might affect combat. This is -2 to all morale checks. This is a gully. You also see this symbol up here. That's whether it's going to block line of sight. So if you have this symbol there, that's partially blocked. So that's not going to completely block line of sight. But if you have 2 of those in a row as you're determining line of sight, then that will block line of sight. Or if you have one of these, that is blocked line of sight. And then you have some that don't have any, symbol on there, so that's not blocking line of sight at all. So you're going to have some of this terrain that's going to come up on the board at different locations, depending on how you move into it. There's also a scouting feature that you'll use, or action that will allow you to kind of maybe determine what the terrain is, or pick between a couple of different cards. But then you also have objectives as well. These are the objectives, what you see with these flags here. And that's a key thing in this game, in Point Blank, is you need to get some of your units will have either a black or a white flag, and you need to have that unit on this objective at the end of the game or at some point during the game to win the game. And different scenarios vary, but a lot of them do have that, have that feature. And like this one, requires a black and a white flag. This one just requires white, but these are terrain as well. So they'll have that blocking terrain or partially blocked or blocked terrain on there, and we'll have, kind of a cover value as well. So, you're seeing some similarities with the cover value with Undaunted, but this blocking is a unique feature because line of sight is really important in this game. In Undaunted, there is no line of sight. It's relatively abstract, and you can the number of squares away will affect combat and make it somebody harder to hit if they're far enough away. But you can see everybody. This one is line of sight is very key. In Warfighter, you're at the ground level, so to speak. So line of sight is handled a little bit different between those different terrains. On what you can see and what you can hit, and it also kind of is somewhat more dependent upon your weapon and what the range of your weapon is on how far you can get down. But line of sight plays a very key role in point blank, and that is how terrain is handled. Is with cards and on this mat or on a grid of some sort. And there you have it. That is how the boards and the terrain are represented in these 3 games. Now let's talk about the type of units that you have in these games. And let's first start with Undaunted again. Now the units will be represented by these counters that will be on the terrain boards, or the little square terrain that you set up at the beginning of the game. And each of these units has like a name. These are scouts. It has its basically its group that it's in, whether it's A, B, or C, and it will have its cover value or defense value that goes along with it, and that factors in with the terrain as well to when you're doing combat or doing an attack. However, basically the health of the units are going to be covered in the cards themselves. You're going to have a deck of cards that you'll start off with some of these units in your deck based on the scenario setup, and then there'll be a pool of these that you can acquire during the game. And the way that you acquire these is by using some of these units' special abilities. Leaders, for example, will be able to bolster or get new units from the pool that are not in your deck and put them into your deck. And that bolster ability, like this can pull 2 from the A group, this can pull 3 from any group, but that you basically buy these cards and get them into your deck. And then the command lets you draw cards from your draw deck. Basically, you're going to have a deck of cards that is built either from the setup or as you acquire cards over time, and you're going to draw a certain number of these cards each turn, and that's going to be the basis of the turn. What you play that turn with these cards is going to be the turn. And once you play them and use its ability, whether it's to get new cards or to move or to a scout, like for example, this one can scout, this can attack, it can do recon, it can conceal. That's what the scout's abilities are. A machine gunner can move, it can attack, it can suppress. So each of these units have some different abilities, and you play it and use one of those abilities, moving on the board, attacking on the board, or if they have special types of attack, that comes into play. But you'll play the card into a discard pile, and then once you've played all your cards for that turn, then you'll rinse and repeat. You'll draw new cards and then keep going, and it's a back and forth between the two sides. You'll start off the round with playing an initiative card. That's what this number is at the top. You'll play one of the cards from your hand to determine initiative. If you really want to go first, you're going to want to play a high card. You have these fog of war cards, which are just basically duds, right? They're all ones. They have no special ability. You get these over time, and there are ways to get rid of them too. But they basically clog up your hand, like in any kind of deck builder, like some deck builders like Legendary or what have you. They're wounds, and they'll clog up your hand. These just clog up your hand because you want to get to the good stuff. You want to get to the units that allow you to move and attack and press the advantage forward. So when you play these, they go into a discard pile. When there's no cards to draw in your deck, then you'll shuffle these back in, and then start drawing from that deck again. Now here's the key on how these are health, because when your unit gets hit, when you do an attack on the board and get hit, then you have to search through the deck or your hand if you have it, and then the deck if it's not in your hand, for a card that matches that unit designation, like whatever was hit. Like if this Scouts B was hit, then I'll have to go through my deck until I find the Scouts B, and then that card goes out of the game. And if you ever have to go into your hand or deck and can't find one of these cards, then that unit goes out of the game and it goes off the board. So that's how this game is, mimics combat, in that this deck of cards, you're getting new units on the board, and you're basically getting new opportunities because there's multiple, there might be, like here, there's 4 riflemen. You might only start off with a few of those, but then you have the opportunity to bring more into play, like with the bolster action, and then you'll have more opportunities to get this rifleman to do stuff on the board. Another key factor in this game is this control. The riflemen are one of the few units that can control certain locations, and that's usually one of the scenario victory conditions, is to have a rifleman in a certain location to control it, or to control a certain number of locations. And sometimes there's variable victory points on them as well. So riflemen are pretty important. So, but if you ever have to, if a rifleman gets hit, you got to go find one of these in your hand or your deck, remove it from the game, and then if there's none to find, well, then that unit is going out of the game and off the board. And so that's kind of how the deck building concept is blended into the combat, or into World War II combat. Now let's turn to the units you find in Warfighter, the World War II tactical card game from DVG. And as I mentioned before, there are 3 different flavors of units. They're all small unit tactical, and I define that as platoon, squad, and individual level. And you're going to have individual and squad level in these kind of cards. So you might have individual, and there's several different types of individuals or individual soldiers that come with Warfighter, and then there's all kinds of expansions. That's how Warfighter kind of does it. And so you'll have these individuals, and these are ones that you can build out. So they'll have certain skill sets, and based on what its cost is, there is its entry, when as I said before, how to move in from location to location. Then it has some special abilities that you might have to cross-reference with different charts in the game, because there's different skills and different special abilities. They have keywords that you always need to reference. It's going to have health. It's going to have a loadout cost, which how much equipment it can hold, and it's going to have what its hit-to-hit is, and then what its cover is. And so that's an individual. That's the one soldier represents one soldier, and you can also add all kinds of skills and gear to that soldier depending on what you want to do with the build out. And that's one of the key factors of Warfighter, is with these individual soldiers, is building them out with different skills and different equipment based on what mission that you're undertaking. But there's also non-player soldiers. They have some of the same references. You're going to have its cost, and that cost is going to be relevant to, as I showed you before, the missions. Whatever that mission level is basically what your cost is, or what your resource level is going to limit how many of these soldiers you can buy and how much equipment and gear that you can buy. But they're going to have an entry, and they're going to have cover, and they're going to have some special abilities as well. But they're also going to have, they can also get some equipment, but they're not fully, capable of being loaded out or outfitted the same as an individual. They're kind of limited on what they get. You have to take whatever's on there. You just can't buy whatever you want. And then you have the most generic of the three, which is a squad. And this is somewhat similar to the cards in Undaunted. You know, the Undaunted cards don't have any equipment or anything. Everything on that card is built on that card, and that's the same here. It's just going to be based on its actions and its range to hit, and it might have a special ability or skill or something that you have to cross-reference it, but everything else is basically going to be on this card, and you do not outfit this at all. So that is how the units are shown out, and they don't show up on the board. Usually these are represented by a counter that you're going to move from location to location on the board, and then they're going to be engaging with enemies that are up here. And the way that the enemies are portrayed, they're a different set of cards, and they're going to be drawn from a enemy deck or the hostile deck. And there's elite hostiles, and then there are regular hostiles. This is all I just pulled out the elite. There are some other types of units as well, but these are the elite hostiles that you might encounter. And as you can see here, they have some cover values. And that number up there, as I showed you before, when you enter into a location, it might show how many different hostiles or the number of hostiles. That's the number. Like that, for example, I think that one location had 7. So if you drew this, you'd put that one on there. And then if you drew that one, you'd put that. So that's 7. You wouldn't go down to the next one in the pile. And these, of course, would be face down, and you'll draw them, and then they'll be out here on the board for you to engage at that location. Now, they're going to have reticles, which is how many that you have to take out at that part, and then they're also going to have its information of how it attacks, and they might actually have some specialized information of how it either moves or how it attacks, and there's a whole sequence of play in Warfighter on, you know, who goes, what's the order of you're taking your actions, and then the enemy moving and taking their actions, and then there's kind of an administrative cleanup phase, and then you kind of rinse and repeat again. Again, this is a solo game, so it is solo only, pretty much. Well, I mean, you can play multiplayer, but you're all playing on the same side. You're not playing opposed per se. And so, at least that's the basic game or the main game. So, so you're going to be encountering these enemies or these hostiles all the time, and they vary in what you're going to get. But again, they're kind of limited by this number up here on as you draw them. And that's going to be based on the location that you're at, and also based on the resources. So if you really took the higher level resource mission and really loaded out and have some high level units on your side, then you're probably going to be facing more of these at each location each time you draw them. And so that's how the enemies are units are portrayed. So you're going to have enemy units. They're going to be on the board. They're going to be above locations, and then your units will be off the board with all its equipment and skills and other things or weapons and other things that it might have as you're moving along the mission. Now, let's take a look at the units that you find in Point Blank V is for Victory from Lock and Load Publishing. Now, one of the big differences here between the other two is there are no counters that represent your units. In Undaunted, you're using counters on the board, and the cards are basically the action cards and the unit's health and the unit's abilities. In Warfighter, the units are represented in your cards, but they're kind of off board or off location, and you're moving a counter from location to location, but you're referencing all the information that are on your unit cards. Here in Point Blank, the cards are your units. So you'll be moving these cards from location to location on the board, and the card as it sits there represents the units. Now let's take a look at some of these units here. You can have leaders, and they're going to have several different types of values that are on there. Let's take a look here at the card here. So you've got squads, you've got leaders, you've got weapon teams, you have all kinds of support weapons. So here's something that is similar to Warfighter in that you're going to have individual weapon units that are attached to your squad, and you're going to have squad level units. And sometimes you might have half squads, and sometimes you might have individual that are represented usually by leaders in that case. So there is some similarity there. However, the units are played differently because these are actually on the board and these are moving around and either taking combat or taking actions as that unit. Now, Point Blank, as I said before, is related to Upfront, or at least inspired by the classic game Upfront, but a lot of the combat and some of the other aspects of this game owes a lot to Lock and Load Tactical, which is also published by Lock and Load Publishing. So, for example, a leader here is going to have a morale value, and then it's going to have its modifier that could affect combat, and it might have a special ability. A squad itself is going to have, its nationality. It's going to have all these action items, and we'll talk about that when we talk about action cards. But suffice to say that there's a lot of iconography in this game, and those icons mean something, so you're going to be needing to look at a chart quite a bit. However, in Warfighter, you're looking up a lot of keywords and skill levels and special abilities all the time as well. So both those games have that in common. You really don't have a lot of that in Undaunted, other than just understanding what the different actions are on the different units. You're going to have its morale for a squad and its firepower, but when you get into vehicles, you're going to have some more numbers here because they might have different types of weapons on them. They might have some machine gun weapons, or they might have some ordnance weapons, and if they have a heavy ordnance, they're going to have this special band that talks about its range and what its penetration is, and it's going to have armor, what is front and flank armor, so you're getting a little bit more detail here. But for the most part, it kind of mirrors a squad card or a unit card in that it's going to have action items and combat and morale as well. And so as we see here, here's a leader for the US, and it has a special ability. It also has an icon. Here's a bazooka, which is an ordnance that's going to be able to take out attack armored weapons. And you can also see here it's got that black flag, as we talked about before. Sometimes to hold a location or a victory point location or a winning location, you need to have either a white or black flag or some kind of combination. This represents that black flag. Here's a white flag. Here's a typical squad with its morale and its combat. And then this superscript here is its range to whether it can attack. And then it has some special abilities. There might be special abilities on here as well, which is somewhat similar to Warfighter in that regard. Here's a tank that has several special abilities and then has a couple different ordinances. And, it's the band there, its armor, and then its morale. And, of course, it has a black as well. You also have this notation on vehicles, whether this is a tracked vehicle. So that's going to make a difference in certain terrain and whether it can get bogged down and the like. As I said, here's some German units. Here's a leader that has a couple of different special abilities. A squad, it's got 2 white flags. Then you have half squad. This is a notion that when, based on combat, if a squad takes a certain amount of damage or hits, then it's going to be reduced to a half squad. And then once that's reduced, then that's out of the game or that's off the board. Here's a Tiger, which is a tracked unit with its different machine guns and ordnance, and then what its armor penetration. This ordnance here is like what its ordnance is against infantry, and then of course it's got special abilities. Again, we'll talk about that when we get to the action cards or the action abilities for each of these 3 games. Here's a half squad for the US for that second line unit there. And then here's a bar. This is just an example. There's a lot of cards. I don't know if there's like 900 or something that come in Point Blank. It is massive. I'll put a unboxing to it down below in my description, but there are a lot of cards to choose from, and there's a lot of different scenarios that will tell you what makeup of different kind of cards or units that you're going to have available in that scenario. So that is an example of the different types of units that you see in Point Blank V is for Victory. Now let's talk about actions, which is a common element for all 3 of these games. However, by starting with Undaunted, we don't have action cards or an action deck. and we're going to go in degrees of importance of how important that action deck is, or how that action deck controls or commands combat, with Undaunted being the least of the three, in that there is no action deck. The actions themselves are on the card. So you don't have a separate action deck, I should say, but you have your actions are in the deck of cards that you have built and that you draw from and that you have in your hand. So, for example, this platoon sergeant has the action of bolster and command. Bolster allows you to pull cards that are not currently in your deck and bring them into play. And then command allows you to draw cards from your deck, so to try to get more cards into your hand so you have more options to play. Bolster for a squad leader is the same, but it is limited to its squad that it controls. And then Inspire is kind of a special ability that allows you to pull cards back into your hand from play. Scout, Scout's important because you cannot move unless a location has been scouted. So the scouts are very important in this game, in that, or at least in most scenarios, where you have to have the territory or terrain scouted to move into it, so they have to lead the way and scout that. But they can also attack, they can also recon and conceal, and that kind of deals with some of their fog of war and getting rid of some of those, those fog of war cards that kind of jam up your hand. Machine gunners move and attack, but they also have a special ability to suppress because of their heavy machine gun that allows them some special combat. And then, riflemen move, attack, and then that control ability. Again, I'm not going to show you all the cards because there's also vehicles that were introduced into the game. There was no vehicles in Normandy, Undaunted Normandy, but they introduced vehicles in Undaunted North Africa, and then of course Reinforcements has more vehicles as well. So there's all kinds of, so your actions are basically controlled on these cards themselves. So you don't have a separate action deck, but you have these actions that come through your deck that are listed on these units as you're playing the game. Again, this is a very unique and novel approach to deck building, or taking, I guess, deck building to a war game environment. And so your actions are on the cards themselves as you draw them into your hand. Now, let us look at actions in Warfighter from DVG. Now, each soldier generally has 2 actions, and you have different things that you can do on your turn. For those actions, on a soldier's turn, you can, remove suppression, move, attack, reload, discard, and draw. That's, from the action deck. Engage in hand-to-hand combat, which may require more than one action, and then you can freely do any of these activities. Play an action card, play a location card, activate an objective card, pass gear to another soldier, lighten the load, or pay retain cost. So these are generally the things you can do on your turn. These take actions. These are free. One of these things here, play an action card, that is from the action card deck. So it does have an action card deck, unlike Undaunted, but you don't need to have this drive the action forward. You can choose one of those different actions, and here are a list of them that are on the board that you actually use to hold the cards, or you can use for a reference for your cards. Again, you don't have to play with this board, but it's a nice setup, so why not, right? But you have these action cards that do all kinds of special abilities, and sometimes they might take other actions or other cards or like experience points in order to play these cards. So you're going to have a hand of these that are usually based on your soldier's health. And you can have a hand of these to play and do things during your turn. As I said, you can play these for freely, but sometimes they have other cost with them. A lot of times they affect your other actions. They'll like modify an attack or give you a special attack or allow you to move other than just your regular movement that you have with one of your actions and the like. So you do have this deck of action cards, but it doesn't drive the play forward. It more augments the play. You have your standard actions that you're going to be doing each turn, up to 2 unless there's something different. There might be some special skills or something that might give you more than one action. And sometimes these cards might give you some extra abilities as well. So that is the action deck in Warfighter. And also that's also where the location cards are located. Like if you draw one of these from the action deck, then that's where you'll draw from the location and put a location out on the board here, which is very important because you can't advance the mission forward if you don't get locations and eventually get to the objective. So you have to advance through a certain amount of locations to get to the objective. These are very important to be drawing these out of the action deck to be playing your locations. Which brings us to Point Blank from Lock and Load Publishing, which, if I haven't said already, thank you, Lock and Load, for sending me this copy. Greatly appreciate that. It's been I've enjoyed playing this and also comparing it with some of these other games and seeing the differences and nuances. Point Blank is the game that relies the most on the action deck. The action deck really controls gameplay and drives everything forward. You really can't do anything without the action deck, which is a little bit different than the other two games. And so you're going to have this action deck here that you'll draw a hand of 5 cards unless the scenario says something different, and you'll have these cards in your hand, and then you can play these cards out of your hand for the symbol, and that's on there. And if it has multiple symbols, you can choose the order of which you want to do it, but you have these different icons that are on the cards, and you play them for that. You'll notice that there's also die faces on here. Well, this game, there's dice that comes with it, and you normally use that for solo play, but you don't have to roll dice. You can use these cards instead, and that's the way the game is meant to be played, is whenever there's a needed to do a die roll, whether it's 1 die or 2 die or what have you, you draw cards from the deck that are face down and check out the results. Why is that important? Well, this deck here is a turn. So you'll go through this entire deck until you get to the end, and that is 1 turn. So depending on the scenario, a scenario might last 1 turn, 2 turns, or what have you. When you go through this deck, that denotes a turn. So, doing things that require die rolls is going to exhaust the deck quicker and move the game forward. And if you're in a position that you think is a pretty good position and you're potentially winning the game, you want to get through the deck as fast as possible. If you're on the other side of that equation, you're wanting to slow things down and trying to maneuver your forces to get to a good point. So what are some of the actions? Well, let's take a look at the board here and take a look at some of the units that you have. We talked about these units before, that they'll have, sometimes there's special abilities that have icon, but like this airborne unit here, all these icons here, you can use those as well. So if you have a hand of cards here and you don't have anything that you can really use at this point, you can always discard one of these cards and then just use the icon of that unit. One of the differences is that a lot of times these actions or icons, you can do it for a whole stack. So like if this is stacked with a whole bunch of other units, then you can play an icon or play an action card for the entire stack. If you're discarding a card just for 1 unit and using whatever its units are, whatever its ability or action abilities are, then you just move that unit. So it's not as efficient, but at least you're not stuck doing nothing, which is one of the complaints of like Combat Commander and games like that, where if you don't have it in your hand, you can't do it. And, some people really don't like that. Some people love that and think it really represents fog of war. Others think it's very frustrating. Here you always have something to do. Even if you don't have the most efficient action or icon in your hand, you can always discard a card and use it on the ability. And here are all the different this is a player aid that lists out all the different icons, the name, and the action, and then, of course, the rule reference where you need to go to on it. So there is a lot of iconography here. This is a little bit of a steep curve figure this out. However, some of the reoccurring icons are pretty straightforward, and you'll understand that after midway playing your first game, and after you play a few games of this. If you don't wait too long between plays, you'll pick this up pretty quick. But this is one of the player aids I use the most when I play this game, because I'm always looking at, well, what icon is that? What is that? Okay, got it. Some of these you're using all the time, so it's like, okay, that's second nature. But sometimes you're like, well, what does that do again? And of course, it has a rule reference as well. So that is the action deck in Point Blank, which really drives it's your turn. It's what you can do in a turn, or what you do in an impulse, and how the game plays. It's very dependent upon this action deck. However, you're never left completely out in the cold with your icons that you have on your individual units. You can still do things with them. Now for some final thoughts or observations or impressions that I have of these three games. And I will note that my explanation of each of these three games, please don't take that as the gospel. Go back and look at someone more qualified than me on gameplay and how you play it, and read the rules. Those are really good resources out there. I've got some gameplay and definitely have some unboxings on some of these, but there probably are other sources out there that you might want to get a deeper dive into and understanding of the games. These are just mainly some of my impressions and how I feel after playing these games. Now, let's start with the rules. When it comes to the Warfighter, I always struggle with these rules. No offense to DVG, but I've always struggled with the Warfighter rules, and they've got this kind of universal rule book now that they use, which is getting better, but I still have still struggle with that. As for Point Blank, it's standard lock and load. It's a good rule book, but it is a little complicated as well. But if I had to choose between these two, I'd probably give the nod to Point Blank. But when it comes to comparing these three games, Undaunted is the easier one to pick up. Now, I say that having been play a lot of Euro games and a lot of hobby games. And so I go back and forth between, war games and Euro games, and sometimes play the mix. This is kind of a mix of that. So if you're in that space, this is very easy to pick up. If you've played deck builders, you understand the general concepts. If you're a diehard grognard and play war games all the time, Undaunted might be something to pick up. It's this whole abstract concept of your unit's health and ability is kind of built into the deck, and your ability to do stuff is built into this deck building concept. But that's my general observation of the rules. Now, when it comes to player aids, I'm going to give it to Lock and Load. They always go above and beyond on, giving you all kinds of different player aids that you use and reuse and the like. Warfighter, they have this universal chart or book, I guess it's more of a chart here, of keywords, because there's all these different keywords that are on the different cards, and this is helpful, but it is a little unwieldy, of trying to hunt and peck, and not everything is on here. Sometimes I go here, look, well, it's got to be on the keyword chart, and it's not there, And then as far as Undaunted, there's really no player aids of sort for that. You mainly just refer back to the rule book or some pages in the rule book, especially like for the actions and the like. So I probably go in this order on the player aids. As far as the art and aesthetics, I'm going to give that to Point Blank. I thought they did a really good job of capturing, and I'm just using some examples here. I mean, there's over 900 cards, or around 900 cards, or some number like that in that game. I really like how they came up with this. I'm not trying to, again, Warfighter I like. It's not the imagery and some of the actual photos and stuff that they use is fine, and it's evocative of that period. But I kind of just leave it with kind of give the nod to Point Blank on that. I'd probably go Warfighter second. And, the art that's in Undaunted, is good art. It's very good art, and it's very consistent across all the different standalones and expansions. It's art and beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and so I would kind of go in this order. This one to me is more, grungy, in the moment, in the trenches. This one is it balances between, the kind of realism versus the very portrayed type of art. So I'd kind of go with that. As far as game board, well, I mean, this is a card game. Should it really have a game board? So this might be an unfair analysis, but I'd give it to Undaunted. These are nice. These little, they're thick. They don't seem to warp. They're dual-sided, and they're durable, and they have good art on it. As the second, I'd probably go with Warfighter. That card, the board, the card board, the board that holds your cards and keeps track of your sequence of play and all that. That's underneath here. I'd go with that second. That's a nice, and it's mounted as well. And then third, I'd go with the Point Blank mat, which you really don't need to use the mat, but the mat is, I've only played without the mat once, and it's using the grid counters gets a little wonky at times. And maybe if I played it a lot more, then maybe using just the counters would be more intuitive. But it's a nice mat, but it's big, and to me it's almost necessary because it's so big, but it has so much space to put the cards, and I really like that. But so I'd probably put it in that order of the Undaunted, Warfighter, and then Point Blank as regard to that. As far as replayability, this is a tough one. I mean, there's a certain number of set scenarios in Undaunted, and then the reinforcements came out with new ones. There's a certain number of scenarios in Point Blank. However, there is a do-it-yourself type mode to Point Blank. And Warfighter, they're not scenarios. They're all based on those mission cards and objectives and the like. So I would probably give a little bit of a nod to Warfighter in the replayability, because you have numerous objectives and numerous missions that you can go on, and then have a variety of terrain, and then of course there's different theaters like Europe and the Eastern Theater, and then the Pacific and what have you. Now I will say that there's a little bit of a dig on Warfighter and their model, in that out of the box you get a lot of replayability. However, to get a lot of this extra stuff, to get a lot of the extra units, to get a lot of the specialized countries and units and weapons and maybe even the different theaters, you've got to go buy their expansions, and they average anywhere, if you get them on sale, anywhere from $10 to $15 or so. But you got to go buy those and collect. It's almost like a collectible card game type mentality. You don't have that in either Undaunted or in Point Blank. In Point Blank, they made a concentrated effort to put everything in the box. So you got everything right there, at least for the Western Front, to play that game. So that's a little bit, that might balance out your thoughts on which one of these you want to play. Warfighter, again, I think there's a lot more replayability. However, it is... you've got to add on to that. You've got to buy into some of that, where in these other two, you really don't. Although, Undaunted does have a standalone North Africa, and then has this expansion reinforcements that adds to both those. So there is a little bit of buying into that as well. As far as solo play, each one of these can play solo. Point Blank has a solo system inside the box. Warfighter is really designed to play solo. And Undaunted is, with reinforcements, this expansion, they added a solo play in there. Having said all that, Warfighter's probably, I lean towards Warfighter because it's designed for that. That's what it's meant for. And probably next would be Point Blank, and then third would be Undaunted in that area. In complexity, Undaunted to me is the least complex, but again, that's with the caveat that I play a lot of deck building games and very familiar with that concept. If you're not, then this has a little bit level of complexity that a wargamer would, for a wargamer, which they're not going to see in some of these other games here. So I would say this is the least amount of complex, but granted, that's if you have some familiarity with deck builders. The most complex probably is Point Blank. There's just a lot going on there. This is basically taking a lot of the concepts from Lock and Load Tactical, which is, I mean, it's not the most complex tactical game out there. However, it's hard not to make a tactical game that doesn't have a certain amount of complexity. And so Point Blank, suffers from some of that it has to bring that along with it. The most complex aspect is this whole line of sight. That kind of messes up some people, how you measure that. Once you play it a few times, it's not that bad, but it takes a little bit getting used to. In fact, that takes longer to get used to than picking up deck building. Warfighter is not overly complex and probably fits in the nice middle ground. However, again, the rule book doesn't do it any favors in that regard. Again, I'm not trying to rag on TVG in that. I'm just trying to give my impressions. Your impressions might be totally different. You might think I'm an idiot talking about any of these games and any of the comments I have on it, and that's fine. You're entitled to it. These are just my impressions, overall impressions on that. As far as simulation value, I think I would say that Point Blank probably has the highest simulation value, to whatever that means, right? What does realism mean in a war game? But it has probably the most in that it's trying to track from its roots in a tactical war game, a small unit tactical war game, and so it probably has some of the better simulation value there, and has some of those concepts that match up to some of the things that we're used to when we're playing a tactical war game. Undaunted probably has the lowest level in that a lot of things are abstracted. Like there's no line of sight. Combat is relatively simplified. You're dealing with these cards that are that are kind of abstracting the unit's ability or a strength level. Although I really like it, and I think it's really novel. Question how much that sims it, but I mean, it still does a good job. I'm not saying that. Warfighter, I'm not saying that's a high simulation. This is Warfighter for a lot of people is more of a beer and pretzels type game. I mean, it's more of a narrative, solitaire narrative driven game. You're trying to accomplish your missions, and but you have these individuals, and this is the most individual of any of these games. So you kind of get attached to those individuals. You get really caught up in the build out. What weapons can they use, and then how do they use those in different encounters, and how are they going to go on this mission? And so it has a little bit more narrative and story built into it, as opposed to that you're recreating any individual battle. Now there are some campaigns and stuff that you can, of course, buy into, and so that might have, over the life of a campaign, might have some sim value. But out of the box, this is kind of a lightweight when it comes to that. I mean, it's not bad. I mean, I picked this up to play kind of a narrative-driven World War II type game. However, they have a modern and they have a shadow version of this. So, I mean, the fact that you can just take and pick that up to different eras also means that, how accurate is it really in simming something, as opposed to it's just being some of the theme is pasted on. But so those are my general thoughts in that area. As far as the use of action cards and gameplay, I like the action deck in Point Blank, and I like the fact that they kind of cured for the the dud hand. Warfighter, you always have something to do, although it gets kind of frustrated sometimes on what you're facing. And you really got to think about how you're going to accomplish that, and you're kind of drawing through that action deck to find a good card to help you. But I like the innovative effect of Undaunted on how they use these actions, how the cards are really kind of multi-use, right? You're building a deck builder. They have the use of they're the life of the unit, but they're also the ability for the unit to do stuff. It's its action deck is the unit card itself. And so that to me is an interesting concept. And it's kind of interesting. You have two card games, and then you have here on Warfighter and Point Blank, and then Undaunted is the one that actually has a board and has counters, and you move counters on a board. And I'm saying that's the most abstract, and that's kind of weird. But anyway, so that's kind of how I'd rank those out. As far as ones that I want to go back to the most. I go back to Undaunted quite a bit but not for the solo, for the two players. So if I've got an opponent, I'm going to want to play Undaunted. If I want to play kind of a quick game and not have it be so involved. If I want to get a little bit more meat on the bones and have a little bit more of a dinner, so to speak, and I have an opponent, I'm going to want to play Point Blank with its action deck, because it's got a lot of good gameplay there. I've played the solo. The solos, I'm not saying the solo's bad. I'm just saying I prefer the two-player version of Point Blank. I think it's a lot more give and take, and the decisions you make on that side. To me, sometimes the solo of Point Blank with the decision trees feels more like you're kind of playing it two-handed. You're still kind of playing the other side quite a bit. As far as a go-to game, if I have an opponent, then I'm not going to play Warfighter. I mean, you can play it cooperatively, but I'm really probably not going to go to that. I'm going to pick one of these two depending on the time and the experience. If someone has some experience in Euro games, then I'll go with Undaunted. If someone has experience in war games, I'm going to go with Point Blank. Having said that, though, Warfighter is something that I probably go to more than either one of these. This one hasn't been out long enough, our Point Blank hasn't been out long enough, so I don't have, it's hard to measure that stat, right? It's probably unfair. But at least between these two, I go to Warfighter more just because you can play it solo. There's a little bit of upkeep, there's a little bit of setup, but I mean, just all the stuff you can do with the units and the build out and have all the different equipment and the way you can customize this and customize your experience, and then the novel approach, the unique approach to the experience, that each experience is going to be new and different. I like that aspect of that. So I probably go to Warfighter more than these two. However, if I've got an opponent, it's going to be one of these two based on the time. So let's go to overall. Who's the winner here? Well, you're the winner, because we've got three, I think, unique, different experience that play in the same space. They play, these are all World War II. These are all, Western Front, if you want to get that more specific, but World War II, small unit tactical games that use cards in a very meaningful way in their gameplay. So you're the winner, because you've got some really good choices out there. Hopefully, me going through some of these comparisons, again, these are not definitive in any respect, but me going through some of these comparisons might help make you make the decision of which one do you want to go to. Are you more of a solo player? Are you more of new to war games and still have a foot in the Euro world? Or are you kind of a diehard grognard and aching for that feel of upfront back in the day? That might color which one of these three you're going to lean towards, or what you want to go to. But I've enjoyed putting this together and kind of thinking about this, and my opinions and my impressions and my observations might change over time the more I play these. I've got to get this to the table a little bit more. I haven't got this to the table since as much with the new expansion, and definitely haven't played the solo enough here. My opinion after more of the solo play of Undaunted might change over time. But there you have it. Those are the three games I wanted to compare, because they have a lot of similarities. They tackle some of the aspects of wargaming somewhat similar in some respects, but again, very different in other respects. These games are more different than they are alike the more you kind of get into them. But they all, I think, represent a unique space in our hobby, and more specifically in the card-based portion of our hobby. So anyway, love to know your thoughts about these three. Am I full of it? Yes, I probably am. But love to know what you think about any of these three, and what your thoughts are on some of the things that I pointed out or compared or said were different. Do you agree, disagree, and why? Love to hear the thoughts. Love to start a dialogue on this. As I said, I think the real winner here out of these games is the players, the people that have access to them. And they each bring something different to the table, but depending on what you're looking for, one might bring more of that and might bring it more of it in the way that you're used to it and want to see that. So anyway, that's what I have for you today. Thanks for stopping by. This was a long one. I had to do it in kind of segments to put it together, which I normally don't do, so hopefully this comes out fine. But again, thank you so much for stopping by and listen to me prattle on. And if you agree with me, please let me know. If you disagree with me, that's okay too. Please let me know there too. In any event, please have a good one and enjoy the rest of your day, morning, evening, whatever time you're watching this. I'm just happy you came along. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching.